Hi, everyone. The Great Depression profoundly impacted a generation of Americans. Part of this was due to the scope and severity of the Great Depression, partly due to the longevity of the Great Depression. This lasted for an entire decade, the entire decade of the 1930s, impacted by the Great Depression. And the only thing that really brought it to an end was the massive government spending that happened as a result of the United States entering the Second World War. But the events of the Depression era have determined the direction of both our social and economic policies ever since. It impacted our relationship to the federal government, how we think about that relationship, and it impacted political alignments in the United States. This photograph, one of the most famous of the Great Depression, taken by the great American photographer Dorothea Lange, showing a woman living in a tent in an encampment for migrant workers in Central California. Photograph was taken right after she learned her husband had lost his job. And you can see the condition this family is living in. These kids are absolutely filthy. She's got two little girls, a small baby on her lap. And this woman looks like she's absolutely at the end of her rope. A haunting photograph, deservedly famous, and captures much of the anxiety that millions of Americans felt during these years. So let's take a quick look at some of the causes and impact of the Great Depression. See in this picture the New York Stock Exchange as it looked in Lower Manhattan in the 1920s. The stock exchange was actually an institution that had been around since the 19th century, but the idea of Americans, ordinary Americans, purchasing stock was a relatively new phenomenon. Really came about in the aftermath of World War I. During World War I, to help pay for the war, the U.S. federal government had sold millions of dollars worth of war bonds. They had these bond drives that involved celebrities of all sorts encouraging the public to buy bonds to support the war effort. It was extremely successful. And a lot of corporations looked at that and thought, well, if there are millions of people willing to buy bonds, maybe we should rethink selling stock to the public. And so this was a practice that grew and expanded during the decade in the 1920s, became very popular for many Americans. We don't know how many Americans were actively involved buying stock, purchasing stock, trading stock. The market was not regulated in the way that it is today. Neither was the banking industry. The sort of regulation that we're more familiar with really is going to come about as a result of the New Deal policies of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Some estimates go as high as about 1.5 million Americans being involved in some degree with the stock market. And out of that, maybe 500 to 600,000 really active traders. But those are rough estimates. We simply don't know. Stocks became inflated in the late 1920s. That is, having a value on the market really beyond their value in real life. This is something that can happen today. And a lot of ordinary Americans became caught up in this. Buying stock became popular. People were encouraged to buy more than they could afford by banks and brokers. Say you wanted to buy $100 worth of stock of a local St. Louis company, and that would have been a substantial purchase in the 1920s. Your broker might say, well, why don't you buy $250 worth? And if you said, well, I can't really afford that, what you would probably hear was, well, we'll loan you the difference. We'll loan you the $150 to add to the $100 you have. That will enable you to purchase $250 worth of stock. And with the way the market's booming, you'll be able to sell that, make a profit, and pay us off with interest, and still make a profit from your investment. So many Americans were persuaded by these kinds of sales approaches. And when the market collapsed, which you read about in Eric Foner's book in late 1929, you have to remember communication was much slower in this era. By the time many Americans learned about what had happened and perceived what had occurred, their stock had lost all value and they had lost everything. And then they're on the hook of owing money to their bank, too. Many banks became caught up in reckless purchasing and investment of stock as well, which resulted in widespread bank collapse. And in turn, people lost their money in banks. Money in banks wasn't guaranteed and backed by the federal government as it is today. That's another thing that came out of the New Deal. And so while the collapse of the stock exchange is probably the best known direct contributing cause of the Great Depression, it's not the only one. So pay attention to what Eric Foner does in distinguishing between some of the long-term causes that he mentions. Agriculture was suffering, the agricultural sector of the economy during the 1920s, for a variety of reasons that he goes into. There was a lot of overproduction, products, more things being consumed than what people could purchase. You can see statistically, even by 1927, the demand for new cars had really leveled off. People simply weren't buying as many as what was being produced. The stock market and its collapse, understandably, a large contributing direct cause, short-term cause to the Great Depression. So here you see some newspaper headlines after the stock market crash of 1929. Again, when this happened, people were alarmed, but there wasn't the perception right away that this was going to spread and worsen and deepen in the way that it did, or last as long as it did. 2 years into the Depression and 3 years into the Depression, as these photographs show, begin to see things that Americans simply had not witnessed before in American history. These are two photographs taken a year apart, one showing unemployed men lined up outside a soup kitchen in Chicago in 1931. This was a soup kitchen actually run by the gangster Al Capone. And the other one you see outside a Red Cross Center in New York City in 1932. And what you see in these photographs became common sight across the United States, with the unemployed lined up for food. This was one visible example of the impact of the Great Depression. It's hard to capture in a short presentation like this the impact of the Depression. Eric Foner talks about some things. Obviously, unemployment rose at the peak of the Depression, which statistically was about 1933 to 34. 25% of Americans were unemployed, a quarter of the workforce. In some American cities, particularly ones that had industries that were hard hit by the Depression, you could find unemployment rates as high as 60, 70% in some particular American cities. This is just something that hadn't been seen previously in American history. So unemployment, a huge problem. And keep in mind that even among Americans who were fortunate enough to keep their jobs, underemployment was a problem, meaning that their wages and hours decreased, and so many people weren't bringing home the same amount of take-home pay that they had before. Farm prices fell, farmers struggled, thousands of farmers lost their homes and farms to foreclosure. Local relief systems and volunteer agencies couldn't keep up. In some parts of the country, school districts just shut down. They weren't getting the tax revenue to keep operating. We know that millions of Americans suffered poor diet during the Depression. People had all sorts of dental problems. Many people couldn't afford to go to the dentist, couldn't afford to go to the doctor anymore, so they stopped. But gum disease became a huge issue during the Depression, and the birth rate declined as it became unaffordable for many people to have children. Marriages were delayed. It was not uncommon for people who were able to be married to live with extended family because they couldn't afford to buy a new home. Suicide rate climbed. Incidents of domestic violence and abuse in households increased. All of these things reflecting the economic strain and the resultant stress and anxiety that rippled through American society as a result of the Depression. Here's another photograph by Dorothea Lange showing a family in California who's lost everything, their home, car, what few possessions they have. They're literally carrying most of them in a child's wagon as they're walking along a road in central California. Scenes like this became very common with millions of Americans on the move, seeking work of any kind, people hopping freight trains to get from one part of the country to the other, especially young people, very common practice. And so as the Depression settled across the land and worsened with no sign of let up, it fell to the sitting president, Herbert Hoover, to try to formulate a response to the impact of the Great Depression. And that's what we'll look at in the next PowerPoint.